seen in this picture, destructive disasters are characterized by damage to general and also healthcare infrastructure, disorganization, chaos, and insecure environments. So, not surprisingly, under these circumstances, healthcare provision is hampered by the infrastructural damage, shortage of medical material and personnel. So the outcome of disaster victims are quite unfavorable. Actually, all the people living in the disaster region are adversely affected. On the other hand, some vulnerable persons, which include but are not limited to the elderly, the children, frail, and chronically ill, are especially at high risk. Among these chronically ill patients, kidney patients or patients with kidney diseases deserve special mention because their survival depends on functioning infrastructure, high technology, and also experienced personnel. So in this figure, you see there are increased threats, increased medical threats for the CKD patients. We all know that additional risk of AKI is increased in this patient population. There is a higher risk of being injured because of the frailty, the mobility challenges, the cognitive dysfunction, cardiac diseases, and still many other reasons. And there is an increased risk of deficient treatment in patients on kidney replacement therapy. On the other hand, there are logistic hurdles for treatment of these victims, such as the non-hygienic living conditions may adversely affect the outcome of these patients. There is inability to obtain medications and increased risk of non-adherence in the treatment. In my previous slide, I tried to convince you about the adverse effects of circumstances on the treatment of these patients. So at the end of the day, there are increased risks, but there is deficient healthcare provision. So when combined all these factors, there is an increased risk of complications, morbidity, and mortality in kidney patients. So moving from all this theoretical information to the real-life experience, these pictures are taken from a C. Jason paper after the Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In the left upper picture, you see the eye of the hurricane. The second picture, upper second picture, shows how Louisiana looks after the storm. At the left lower picture, you see the appearance of dialysis unit of Tulane University. And at the last picture, you see the patients waiting to be dialyzed in this unit. If you cannot dialyze these patients, you have to manage their problem. Actually, this was the reason why we introduced the terminology or concept of disaster nephrology, which we describe as the art and science of providing health care to the disaster victims with acute or chronic kidney problems. On the other hand, despite the severity of the problem, patients with acute or chronic kidney diseases usually are not included in state or regional disaster plans. So the kidney health care providers and the patients must be prepared to disasters to survive the disaster actually. So how healthcare provision can be managed, let me say, in disaster circumstances. But before moving to that, let me briefly describe the spectrum of patients with kidney diseases. As I thought, these patients may suffer from acute kidney injury or they may suffer from AKI. Most of the time, in destructive disasters, AKI is related with crush syndrome. On the other hand, there are many other etiologies of acute kidney injury in disaster circumstances. Prerenal, intrarenal, or postrenal AKI may develop in these patients as well. considering the spectrum of problems in patients with CKD, all the spectrum may suffer from adverse effects, adverse logistic circumstances after disasters. I mean the patients not on kidney replacement therapy, patients on dialysis or transplant recipients. But among all this spectrum, probably the most important one is hemodialysis. Hemodialysis is strictly needed for the CKD patients, but also for the survival of patients suffering from kidney injury. On the other hand, as we all know, hemodialysis is quite complex, which needs functioning infrastructure, disposables, supplies, and also experienced personnel. Vast majority of the functioning hemodialysis units may be damaged, and then there is an overload of the still functioning units, so there are so many logistic problems. How to be prepared for disasters? Actually, the first thing to be done is risk assessment and hazard identification. And if possible, the best solution would be to evacuate the patients as soon as possible. But as you know, this is only possible for the predicted disasters, such as hurricanes. On the other hand, vast majority of the disasters are unpredictable. Therefore, we should be prepared at the national, regional, or institutional levels. In all these levels, two major strategies are applied. The first one is all hazards approach, and the second one is patient or disaster specific strategy. The rationale of all hazards approach is that all types of disasters share certain commonalities, such as disorganization, disruption of transportation, communication, tap water, electricity, and also a single country may be affected from various types of disasters. In a certain country, you may suffer from hurricanes, from armed conflicts, from earthquakes, and all other stuff. Therefore, all countries around the globe should be prepared for the safety and security issues during disasters, and also for the functioning command system, control system, communications, triage practices, search capacity, and management of human resources. On the other hand, in addition to this all hazards approach, some disasters are characterized by specific types of patients. For example, after earthquakes, we see so many crash rates after kidney injury. After wars, we see gunshot wounds very frequently. Or after flooding, we see drowning. So we should be prepared both in the strategy of all hazards approach and also disaster specific approach. When you combine these two strategies, then you may get the best results. National preparedness is a huge issue and it's beyond the scope of this talk. So I will briefly try to describe the regional and institutional level preparations. At the regional level, structural preparedness is so important. So the infrastructure should be functioning, such as the transportation, electricity, tap water, and communication. Basic elements of life are needed to survive, such as the nutrition, housing, security, communication. Health facilities and other buildings should be stand for provision of health care. We should develop, this is much more easy, disaster scenarios and action plans. A disaster scenario answers the question of why, what, who, how, and when in disaster conditions. And among these, probably the simplest one, but one of the most effective one, is educating all stakeholders which may be affected by disasters, such as the healthcare providers, the patients, and all other stakeholders. We should develop algorithms, action plans, and to-do lists. The institutional level, at the institutional level, the same principles are valid. To go into some detail, we should try to look establish the structural and non-structural hazard mitigation for all facilities, but especially for the dialysis units. Also, we should be prepared for the healthcare provision. You may think the first one is the hardware, the second one is the software. I'm so sorry for this very busy slide. My mentor told me that never use busy slides during your presentation, so now I feel guilty, but I will just tell about the headings. We should be prepared for developing emergency response plans and communications plans. We should make some administrative work, and we should organize training courses, especially drills, because vast majority of the patients and also healthcare providers are inexperienced about disasters. Healthcare providers should be prepared for disasters as well. First of all, they should ensure their own and relatives' health. They should get training on post-disaster functions. They should organize and participate in drills. And they should make logistic planning for the healthcare provision. They should prepare, very importantly, medical documents for their patients, because many patients need to go to or have to go to the other facilities for their treatment, and they should prepare patient educational material. Coming to the issue of preparing the patients, it's quite complex. So the patients should get training on oral preparation, and also they should be trained on what to do at the moment or just after the disaster. So in the oral training heading, probably we should look, the patient should be informed about the facility plan and about the alternative facilities if their units do not function. The patients should be given medical reports. They should be trained on how to care their vascular or peritoneal accesses. They should be trained on stocking medications, supplies, and food. And they should prepare emergency go bags and also specific training on just after the disaster, how to get diet and personal action plans. So the next issue is what should the patients do just after the disaster? These algorithms are taken from the nephrology manual, and we will provide some more detailed algorithms on this issue as the Kidney Relief Disaster Task Force of the ERA. First of all, the patients should be informed about the major problems that they are going to face, and then step by step, they should be trained what to do. If they can reach their healthcare providers, what to do. If they cannot reach their healthcare providers, what to do. And at the end of the day, if the problems persist, they should suggest to contact the authorities or referral or self-relocation to the other regions or even abroad. Of course, one of the most important things is what to do if the patients are hit by the disaster when they are connected to dialysis machines. Actually, there are two major techniques: the clamp and cut and clamp and cap techniques. They should be trained on these issues. Similar concerns apply for the PD patients as well. Shortage of PD solutions and supplies are a reality, which may result in under-dialysis and subsequent complications. So they should be suggested to keep a 2-week stocks of PD supplies. What we know is all disasters are characterized by hygienic crowded shelters, increased risk of infections. So they should be trained on maximum care for hygiene during the exchanges. Lack of caregivers is a possibility and may interfere with PD application, especially in children, elderly, and frail patients. So the patients should be trained on CAPD exchanges, of course, if possible. In patients applying APD, in the case of an acute episode of a disaster, the patients should be trained on emergency disconnection similar to hemodialysis patients. And if power outage is a problem, they should be suggested to switch to CAPD, hemodialysis, and also try to get help from the authorities. So these educational material are taken from the Kidney Relief Task Force of ERA. They will be freely available within weeks, if not within days. We are still preparing many infographics, booklets, and leaflets to help our patients in disaster conditions. Last but not least, shortage of medical items is a real problem during disasters. So after the Marmara earthquake, we calculated the amounts of supplies that would be needed for treating for 1,000 of crash patients. Why do I say 1,000? Because after the potential earthquake, we expect for 3,000 to 5,000 of crash syndrome victims. So we are making logistic plans nowadays. So this is just for 1,000 patients. You see, one needs to stock 35,000 liters of crystalloids, more than 8,000 sets of hemodialysis, more than 13,000 units of blood and blood products, which is simply impossible. So in disaster preparedness, with regard to shortage of medical items, what can you do is just make help calls just after the disaster. To conclude, dear chairs and dear colleagues, disasters are inevitable and kidney patients are at very high risk. Intermittent nature of disasters results in forgotten knowledge, so training, especially CMEs, are must and guidance is needed. Probably the good news is that as the Kidney Relief in Disaster Task Force of ERA, we are preparing a disaster nephrology manual, which will be a peer-reviewed virtual guidebook and will include pragmatic, concise information which is easy to read and implement. And we hope to finish this project within 2 years. I thank you for your kind attention.